The other publication was Sign Language Acquisition with Baker, Directions in Sign Language Acquisition Research with Gary Morgan. The most interesting, The Signs of a Savant, Language Against the Odds with Gary Morgan, Neil Smith, and Ianthe Simply. And the most latest one, most useful one for all PhD students working in sign language research, The Research Methods in Sign Language Studies, a Practical Guide with Eleni Orfando and Gary Morgan. So we are again very pleased that Bensi, you're here today. We've wasted a lot of time in this glitch. So please, Bensi, I hand it over to you and we can start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Dean and the Linguistics Department in the university, and of course to Dr. Sharma, my former PhD student. I'll start the presentation now and hope it works. I've asked it to share. But nothing is happening. That's interesting. I've asked it to share, but nothing seems to be happening. Let me try again. Sorry, I don't know why it's not letting me share. Let's try one more time.
Ma'am, can you please try again? I've made you the host.
Is that working now? Can you see that window? Can anyone let me know if you can see it?
You don't see
Hello?
it.
You don't see it. It's up on my screen as if it's being shown, so I'm not quite sure what the issue is.
It's coming. It's come now.
Oh, okay. Hang on. It's going to disappear again because I've just tweaked something. You're sharing your screen. Okay. Click here. Can you see it now?
It's not visible. No, ma'am, it's not visible.
It's not there?
No.
Hang on. It's telling me that it's sharing. Let's try again. A window. Share that. It's telling me that it's sharing at the moment. So it may take a while to come up. I don't know.
Yes, ma'am. Now it's up.
Is it not?
We can see your PPT.
If somebody could tell me what they can see, it would be helpful because I don't know.
We can see your PPT.
You can see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start then and hope it's okay. But if it gets stuck or it goes slow, can somebody tell me so that I will pause and not just keep carrying on? Okay, so I'm going to talk about multimodality in sign language. Now, that may sound an odd topic, but I hope I can explain it as I go along. It's very slow responding, I see. Okay, so I want to take as a starting point that order. Language didn't evolve by people initially gesturing and then stopping gesturing and using voice. it seems to be the case that humans have probably always communicated with sound where that was available and with visual information, so gesture. And we know that when humans communicate, that's what happens. Both sign language and spoken language take place. I hear a lot of background noise. Okay, so first I'm going to talk a bit about gesture, language, and multimodality generally. And then I'll move on to talk about the brain in relation to both sign language and spoken language. Applied issues, particularly to do with deaf children's experiences of language. I'll then talk a bit about a new area of research that I've become involved in, but is also a growth area in which there are many challenges, and that's areas related to multimodality and automated translation. And finally, I'll try to wrap it up with some conclusions and directions for both research and practice. Now, I want to start by showing you this slide, which is a drawing from an illustration that was in Nature in 2012. And this chart is telling you, there's a lot of information on it, but don't worry about it. What it's telling you is that as from birth onwards, different types of brain activity become more or less important. And sometimes people have talked about critical periods, but I'm going to talk about sensitive periods. So from birth to early childhood is a sensitive or critical period for the development of the senses. You know, there's a big difference in experience between someone, for example, born blind, compared to someone who goes blind in adulthood. And similarly with deafness, the senses tune themselves in the early part of life. The next important sensitive period is that for language. And as you'll see that language, again, the ability of the brain to develop language peaks in early childhood, somewhere between infancy and childhood. And then it tapers off. So everybody knows that if you try to learn a language as an adult, it's a lot more difficult than trying to learn a language when you're 2 years old. Of course, cognitive abilities are the most prominent. Sensitive period is in throughout childhood, so the period of formal education and so on. And the fact that this is true of the brain, that there are different sensitive periods, we have to take into account when we think about issues to do with language. Now, just to repeat a bit what I said, human language evolved for face-to-face communication. I know I'm sitting here talking to you thousands of miles away, but really we humans did not evolve to communicate in the dark or at long distances. So a lot of what's important in communication has to do with the environment, the shared environment that we communicate in. Human language, as I've said, is essentially multimodal, and that's particularly important in relation to deafness because there's very strong evidence of the integration of different channels. So not just sound for spoken language, but vision contributes a lot to spoken language. And for sign language, it's not just hands, but face, head, body, mouth in particular also contribute a lot to language processing. And another point which people sometimes ignore, but is very important, is that multimodality is not only about communication, but also about cognition in the signer. I'll talk about this a bit more, but just generally, we often gesture not to communicate to others, but to help ourselves think. So gesture is a way which we use to help make sense of the world for ourselves. I'm sorry, the slides are a bit slow coming up. Okay, everyone knows that children express ideas in gesture before they have language, whether they're deaf or hearing children. And there are differences among children, and the age at which children gesture ideas actually is a very good indicator to the age at which the child will express those ideas in language. So gesture not only precedes, but also predicts the onset of linguistic milestones. And just as an example from spoken language, children will often gesture and produce a word when they're very young. So those kinds of combinations, gesture plus word, when those begin to occur, that's an indicator that the next step coming up very soon will be the combination of two words. So we can look at gesture as being a way of assessing a child's communication development. So where there are delays in developing gesture, this is often useful as a diagnostic tool to pinpoint difficulties with language which will appear later. So where there are delays or atypical use of gesturing, this is very often a predictor of language problems. We also know that gesture can facilitate learning, including the learning of words. And there are some programs which now use gesture as a tool for intervention, even before there's a delay in spoken language. In other words, you can start intervening with hearing children who have spoken language difficulties, even before you've seen a spoken language problem, because they have atypical gesture. And again, to put this another way, infants move from just perception of things out there in the world to cognitive representations. And so by 12 months, even if there's no evidence of language yet, children recognize the importance of gestures and are producing actions with objects. So the first sort of step between a gesture and a word is to hold an object and perform the characteristic action with that object. So a child might hold a comb and comb their hair, right? Not really, but pretend to comb their hair. That's already abstracted from combing your hair. And then, of course, the next step is to be able to perform the action without the object, right? So when a child can pretend to comb their hair without having a comb in their hand, that is a more abstract representation. And for those who know a sign language, you will recognize that that's what early signs look like. The child will perform an action without any object, and that action is iconic and represents an abstraction to what to something which is a symbolic representation. And children continue to use this sort of gesture, and it influences vocabulary learning, you know, until children are about 3 years old, whether they're learning a spoken language or a sign language. Of course, if they're learning a spoken language, then these representational gestures are largely replaced by words without the gesture. And for a child learning a sign language, these gestures are replaced by signs, which may look like gestures, but which are functionally different and more abstracted. And to give an idea of the way gestures and language can complement each other through life, we did a test where people had to describe the shapes of objects from pictures. And one picture which had 3 circles on the left was a very small circle, and then a middle-sized circle, and then on the right a large circle. And we didn't say to people to gesture, we just asked them to say what they saw. And what you get is people doing this, if you can see me, circles going from smaller to larger. So the person is basically representing the information both in speech and in gesture, but interestingly, there's information in the gesture that's not in the speech, because in the gesture you have going from smaller to larger laid out in the spatial representation they occur in, and that information is not presented in the speech. And as I said, gesture aids cognition. That's an illustration of someone doing an addition problem. And it's been found that if children point in that way, so simultaneously to 2 of the digits, they're actually better at getting the answer right than if they don't gesture. If you stop them gesturing, they perform worse on arithmetical problems. And that little graph on the right shows you the difference between how accurate people are when they gesture and speak versus when they just speak without gesture. Okay, I want to move now to talk about sign language, spoken language, and the brain. And again, to think about modality in relation to that. So studying sign language is really important when we are thinking of researching language in the brain. Of course, most of what we've known over the years about language processing in the brain has been based on studies of spoken languages. And with sign languages, we can ask a very important question. If all of that research on spoken languages is telling us something about language, regardless of its modality, whether it's spoken or signed, or whether the information about language that we had from earlier research is specific to languages which occur in the auditory vocal modality, in other words, spoken languages. And where we find differences that seem to be related to modalities, does that tell us anything about how language is processed and what systems in the brain support language? So the question is, where in the brain is sign language processed? When I'm doing a face-to-face talk, at this point I always ask people to raise their hands, raise their left hand if they think sign language is processed in the left hemisphere, raise their right hand if they think it's processed in the right hemisphere, and raise both hands if they think it's processed in both hemispheres. I can't see your hands today, but think of that question. We know that spoken language is overwhelmingly represented in the left side of the brain. So bearing that in mind, what are we likely to find when we look at sign language in the brain? So as I've said, we know that the left hemisphere is crucial for producing and understanding spoken language. And I have to say that the research we've done indicates that this is also overwhelmingly true of sign languages. Even though sign languages are visual, not auditory, even though they look so different from spoken languages, to the brain, language is largely language, and it doesn't matter whether it's spoken or signed. This is an image from our first brain study, which was done 20 years ago. And we created sentences in British Sign Language in BSL, and we also had English translations of those sentences. There were two groups of participants, deaf native signers, so deaf people who also had deaf parents and who had grown up using sign language, and also just a group of hearing non-signers. And where obviously people were looking at videos of sentences in the MRI scanner, and the hearing participants were looking at somebody speaking sentences. So it was audio-visual English. And we did that so that it wouldn't be such an enormous difference between just listening and watching someone speak, because as I've said, that's the more natural way to communicate. So on the left side, the left column, which you can see at the top is a left hemisphere. You can just about see that it's the left side of the brain, and below is the right side of the brain. And the column on the left is of deaf people watching sign language. And on the right is hearing people watching somebody speaking and hearing somebody speaking English. And you can see that, first of all, that both are left lateralized, the sign language on the left and the English on the right. There is activity on the right side of the brain in both spoken and sign language, and that has a function too, but the dominant side is the left. And the two classic language areas, Broca's area, which is in the frontal cortex, so further to the left in the top pictures, and Wernicke's area, which is in the temporal cortex, that's the bit kind of in the middle, are both used. The main difference that you see is at the back of the brain on the left side, and that's because there's more visual information in sign language. It's a sort of lower level issue, whereas in spoken language, although they did see somebody speaking, it was pretty low level. Okay, time is moving on. So now let me show you, another set of pictures. You should all now be familiar with left and right brains. And this now compares not only speech and sign, but other kinds of communication. So in figure A, finger spelling. So the representation of English letters by orthography of English. A BSL on the right. At the top of spoken words, and as again, you'll see the remarkable similarity between spoken words and BSL, and also between finger spelling and those two. So the same areas largely are activated. Text is written, so looking at written words in the lower left. Now this looks different from spoken words, finger spelling, and BSL. As you can see, there's really no activation in the temporal area of the brain. And finally, on the right is looking at static pictures. And as you can see, that looks extremely different from the other four. And part of that is that spoken words, finger spelling, and sign language have signals that change rapidly over time, whereas the more static symbols, written words, and pictures are different, and pictures the most different because they're not linguistic at all. Okay, let's move on to talking about language communication and educational attainment. We've talked about sensitive periods, and I want to come back to that idea because the existence of sensitive periods tells us that if a child is delayed in learning language, they will never reach the normal level of mastery. So there is a sensitive period in which a first language must be learned. If that language is missed, if that a period is missed, there will never be full development of syntax, of phonology, and verbal working memory. So that's a pretty shocking thing to hear, that could happen. It very rarely happens with hearing children, but actually late first language learners are the vast majority of children who are born deaf. So delays in learning language because you're deaf will have lifetime consequences. So obviously, if you're a deaf child with deaf parents, you don't have delays in learning a first language because your parents are signing and you learn a first language at a typical age. But for deaf children, sometimes because people believe they should only learn spoken language, and of course they can't hear spoken language very well, they are delayed, or people are opposed to the use of sign language, or there are no people out there who can teach the child sign language because of the environment they are in. So I think we have to accept that for the vast majority of deaf individuals, they have experienced delays in learning a first language. And the evidence is out there. People have collected data since, for 100 years. It's still the case that 3/4 of deaf children are poor readers. They have below average scores on most literacy, phonological, and spelling tasks. They have smaller vocabularies. On the other hand, they have a normal spread of scores on nonverbal intelligence, on speech reading, on semantic fluency, naming numbers, etc., if these tests are administered in a language they can use, of course. So semantic fluency tests, you might ask the child to name all the animals they can think of in a minute, and their scores are normal on that. It's the more complex linguistic tasks which they fail on. As another way to illustrate that, the horizontal line is what the mean is for the population at large in reading single words, and that is given across. So you have single word reading scores in the horizontal axis. You have vocabulary scores, size of vocabulary in the vertical axis, and you can see that the better readers, that they're in the upper right, they're on the right side. The upper right quadrant are those with large vocabulary scores and who consequently read well. And you can see that actually the distribution is largely below the middle of the graph. So most deaf children read poorly. So, again, why do they have problems? There's limited early language experience. If they're being exposed only to spoken language, even with cochlear implants, those come late, so they have limited language experience for the first year of life. They don't hear spoken language. Then they have poor speech perception and production. That leads to poor phonological representation and phonological awareness, which is required for reading. That's associated with poor vocabulary development. Word learning is inefficient, and they end up with poor reading and poor language. And this problem has not been solved yet, although people have been saying to themselves for 100 years that it's being solved. I want to say a little bit about cochlear implants because that's very important. They're very successful in restoring hearing. So children with cochlear implants can hear, but there are still problems with language and educational outcomes. They're very variables. Again, some statistics, they're now about 10 years old, but there's no suggestion there's been an enormous change. So in terms of verbal reasoning, deaf children with cochlear implants were about 30% were below a standard deviation, so poor. 20% of children with cochlear implants did not progress in their reading between primary and secondary school, and only 38% scored within one standard deviation from hearing students in writing. So as I've given you the answer as to why this is so, but just I think dwell on the fact that these children have not overcome the problems associated with early deafness and exposure only to a spoken language. There's also a lot of emphasis on actually not only emphasizing spoken language, but reducing visibility of oral actions. So parents are often advised not to let the child gesture or use sign language before implantation. And the explanation is that if a child is exposed to a sign language, this might disrupt their the way the brain, the auditory regions of the brain develop. Now, if we go back to that multimodal idea, this is just cannot be the case because language is multimodal. So children should be exposed to both the face and to the sound when someone is speaking. Children should be exposed to sign language. It doesn't inhibit auditory cortical development. So if you actually believe the argument that deaf children should not be exposed to sign language and that they should not be allowed to use speech reading, lip reading, these crucial months and years of the early ones are not being attended to, and deaf children need language and communicative input of all kinds from birth. That's how cognitive development will proceed. Cochlear implants are great. They're an amazing breakthrough in delivering hearing, but we shouldn't be measuring success in terms of hearing. A successful outcome for a cochlear implant should be in terms of well-developed language skills and cognitive development that's at normal levels and educational attainment at normal levels. And the best way to guarantee that is making sure that children are acquiring a first language within the early years, however that's achieved. And to reiterate, multimodal communication gives access to spoken language structure by eye, because of course one can see the face and lip read, and complements auditory processing. Exposure to sign language in children enables the development of vocabulary, as well as enhancing communication, of course, and has the potential to have a positive impact on the development of speech processing where a child has received a cochlear implant. Okay, so now I'm going to come back to children at the end, but I now want to talk about an area that is increasingly producing large numbers of research papers, and this is automated translation between sign language and spoken language. But there are many challenges, and I'm not going to apologize for being quite critical about a lot of the research that's been produced. We've said sign languages are multimodal. They involve the hands, the body, the face, the head, the eyes, the mouth. And therefore, you know, the presence of all of these is related, of course, to how the brain processes multi-channel languages. And most attempts to produce automated sign processing systems take little or often no account of these factors. So most research on automated translation focuses entirely on the hands and not on any other part of the body, which is essential in sign language. It's used. Okay. So thinking through the issues with research that's currently taking place, so, you know, good translation from or into a sign language needs either to start with, you know, very accurate tagging of the source material, or have facility, you know, have access to enormous corpora. If you think of how large the database is out there for work on written English, but there are very few comprehensively tagged and annotated sign language corpora. that might be used in translation work, but even these corporate tend to be ignored. I mean, they're just not used. People instead create a limited corpus of a very small number of signs. There's also a problem with the domains in which people are exploring. So there's a lot of interest in designing signing avatars, but most of the domains that people have trialed aren't those in which any deaf person wants or needs an avatar. So, for example, translation into sign language for weather forecasts on television, totally unnecessary. I mean, you just look at the map, it has all the information. So, why put effort into that? And, if you work on that, the output you produce, the translation into sign language, is at best, it's ungrammatical and it's unnatural. So at best, people don't understand it. And at worst, it can end up with potentially dangerous situations. So people who want to create avatars for translation in hospitals or at the doctor's surgery, this is not a good idea because the person is relying on this information. But I actually think, well, I'm critical about that, but the main problem, I think, is something different. It's to do with a number of challenges, technological, cultural, and linguistic. So let me say a little bit about cultural challenges first. Okay, so here are a whole load of pictures I've just taken off the internet of various things. And you'll notice that most of these are all either avatars or they are instrumented. The person is wearing some kind of gear. Now, there's an assumption out there that deaf people would actually be interested in putting on all of this equipment in order to communicate with hearing people. And actually, the answer is they don't. They have no interest in being instrumented. They might be interested in getting hearing people instrumented, but they don't want to wear all this stuff for communication, even if it worked, which it doesn't. And in relation to the avatars, which are mostly at the bottom of the screen, there seems to be a tendency to create avatars with giant hands. You can see that in the one on the lower right and the one on the lower left. And since we've said that sign language involves the head and the body and so on, having giant hands doesn't help. It doesn't make things better as long as there's no emphasis on getting the face, body, and so on, lips, accurate. So, what are these people doing wrong? They're creating systems that translate sign for word, and obviously sign languages have different grammars to spoken languages, so that will not create understandable sign language. As I've said, there's no face, head, or body information. They have enlarged hands. They have often gloves or other wearable technology. And I have to say, there's often really offensive terminology. I mean, terminology doesn't matter that it's offensive to me, but it's offensive to deaf people. These are quotes I've taken out of papers. They talk about normal people versus deaf people. No, they're hearing people versus deaf people. They often sorry, I'm getting a lot of background noise. They often describe people as dumb or deaf and dumb. This is not acceptable terminology, or describing people as mute. I mean, if they're deaf, just call them deaf. If you want to talk about deaf people who sign, call them deaf signers. But, you have to use acceptable terminology in referring to people. And I've just got some quotes here which I've taken out of papers that were published this year and last year, so this is old stuff. They're either completely inaccurate in what they say about sign language, or they insult deaf people. So gesture-based communication, called sign language, is the fundamental communication channel between hard of hearing individuals. No, hard of hearing individuals don't use sign language. And calling something gesture-based is no more informative than saying that something is auditory-based. And I have no idea what is meant by communication through signing is a visual motion dialect. It doesn't mean anything. Next quote, deaf and dumb people usually use sign language as a means of communication. They do mention non-manual physical expressions, but then they say it helps them to communicate with each other and with normal people. Normal is not an acceptable term. And the last one, sign language is a basic tool. No, it's a language. For those who haven't received the gift of speaking and listening, it's not a gift. It's, how you are. Normal people generally do not learn sign language. Hearing people don't learn sign language. And again, the people who use it are not hearing impaired or speech impaired. They are deaf people. Okay. So a linguist's view is to ask, what do tech researchers know about sign language? And a view, considering we're talking about deaf communities and their languages, what's the development of the deaf community and deaf people in development of the technology? So a real commitment to accessibility involves finding out whether the technology is what deaf people want and need. And if you don't think about that, you can't do adequate research. I've also given a list of things that people in tech research, and particularly where it's funded commercially, should consider. So they should be paying deaf people who work with them, not getting volunteers, and being engaged with deaf communities to find out what deaf people want, and to actually help support programs that communities themselves see as important, such as the development of sign language resources for teaching, interpreter training, and education of teachers of the deaf. If you're committed to accessibility, you have to consider all of these factors and how you can keep in touch long term. I mean, think about not where you are with your model, but where is that taking you? So I think there need to be better partnerships between sign language linguists and software engineers, including support for human work on tagging corpora. There has to be inclusion within project teams of fluent signers. And I don't, you could think I'll get in a hearing person who can sign, but I actually think you need to get deaf scholars. You have to think about funding support for deaf people to develop careers in technology and so on. You need to constantly keep in touch with deaf communities while developing research plan, not when you launch some scheme that you've produced and then you invite a bunch of deaf people to come along. No, it has to be at the time when you're thinking about a research project, you ask deaf signers what they want. And I've given you a reference at the bottom here to a paper that came out last year, which addresses specifically this: do deaf communities actually want sign language gloves? And the author is a deaf American researcher. I want to now return, just before I finish, to I've made some policy guidelines for tech researchers, but here are some policy guidelines for people involved with working with deaf children. And I've adapted these from a really excellent paper by Matt Hall and colleagues from 2019. So, one has to think right away when a child is diagnosed whether they're at risk for language deprivation, or if identification of deafness is delayed, whether they actually are already deprived of language. It's important for professionals not to perpetuate misinformation and tell parents, for example, that their child will be delayed, but they'll end up, with normal levels of language ability. I think it's important to support the acquisition of a sign language from birth onwards. Different cultures, different communities, different countries will have different ways to do that, but it's important. Curricula for preschools and schools needs to be revised to reflect best practice. Information given to families and interventions that support the acquisition of both spoken and sign language. Any policies must be based on evidence, not just belief that what you're doing is the right thing. You have to think critically about the methods and conclusions of research, and you have to know the difference between often very emotional arguments against sign language and what the practical barriers are out there to supporting sign language acquisition. It's important to discuss with families and with teachers that the child has to learn at least one natural language as early as possible. The critical period applies to both spoken language and sign language. If a child fails to learn spoken language and is then sent to a signing school at age 11, it's too late. They will not learn sign language at the level of a first language. The same is also true of written language. People need to know that deaf children are very often delayed or never achieve good literacy skills. Funding needs to be out there for deaf people working with deaf children, deaf mentors, deaf advisors, deaf teachers, sign language classes for parents and other members of the family, and other resources. Assessment and monitoring of language goals is critical. It's extraordinary that there is so little assessment of sign language development, or indeed of language development. Very often it's speech that's assessed. So you have to look at proficiency in spoken language and sign language, and you have to think about the child's experience of learning and opportunities to learn the language. And if there's a problem because there is insufficient opportunity, then one has to invest in the development of assessment tools. And the same point as I made with technology, one has to seek guidance from deaf people, adult deaf people with their experience of growing up deaf, and older deaf people, members of the deaf community, and you have to incorporate their perspectives in all research related to sign language. Sign languages are the languages of deaf communities. Deaf communities, their members are the masters of this language, and they need to be involved at all levels. Well, I've run over time a bit, but we started late, so thank you.
Bensi, we have a few questions in the chat box.
Okay, I'll have a look at that.
Questions, yeah. I can read them out if you wish, or I think...
No, I can see them.
Yeah,
Hang on,
yeah.
let me just go back to the first one. Okay. Right, okay. So the first one that came up is, are facial expressions and body language used to communicate sign language? Absolutely. I think you need to think of a parallel in spoken language, which, for example, would be something like prosody. tone of voice. We very often make understand. I mean, some spoken languages really use pitch and so on. So Chinese and other tone languages, but in all spoken languages there is a flow of pitch, and that is an example of multimodality in spoken language. So yes, facial expressions and body language are used to communicate. Sometimes they're part of the language, so some mouth actions and some use of gaze and eye opening and closing are actually more linguistic, and sometimes body movements and so on are just part of face-to-face communication. I'm sure you know that if you're in a large auditorium and you can only see the backs of people's heads, you can always tell the person who is speaking because they're the one person whose body is moving. And that's the same for spoken and sign language. And sign languages indeed do have their own grammars, and they are not like spoken language grammars because they make use of two articulators, the hands, which can move independently. When for spoken language we only have one set of articulators. So sign language grammars are intrinsically different. They make more use of simultaneity than spoken languages, which are kind of more linear in grammar. But there are differences between the grammars of different sign languages. Unfortunately, most research on sign languages has been on European. I include American Sign Language, which is originally European. And there's much less work on Asian and African and South American sign languages. And so we don't yet know really how different sign language grammars are because there's been very little, relatively little research. Okay, where does sign language and gesture stand when thinking about the origins of human language? Well, unfortunately, we can't directly use sign language, any sign language, as evidence about how human language developed. And that's because deaf people, somebody else has coined this term, they have language-ready brains, right? They're already evolved and human like the rest of us. So sign languages don't tell us anything directly about how human language might have evolved. But it does remind us that human communication has probably always been multimodal. It's involved vocalization and it's involved some kind of visual activity using the face and the hands and so on. Humans mostly communicate in the light, there's not that much opportunity to talk in the dark. And certainly in ancient times, people probably went to bed when it got dark. So, there was always some visual element in language. However, there are some interesting clues. I and others have written about the presence in sign languages of some sort of fused forms where there is both an iconic hand action and a mouth action that kind of mirrors what the hand is doing. And that does give some indication that that might have been a way that humans moved from this kind of gesturing, which was probably very iconic, to the kind of more abstractness of spoken words. I'll give you one example. So the sign, to grab is in many sign languages also accompanied by a mouth action, which looks like this. And you can see there on the mouth, you actually have a syllable that looks a bit like cup or up, something like that. So that sound is not iconic, although the gesture of grasping something is. So we can get some. So the answer is, it's a good question. We can't get direct evidence, but it's a really interesting area to pursue. What is the basis of sign language in the sense of morphology and semanticity? Okay, so first of all, as comparing any two languages, so the lexicon of British Sign Language is not equivalent to the lexicon of English. I mean, for some English words, there's more than one sign, and for some signs, there's more than one English word. So the semantics, the structure of the lexicon is different, and it's different for any languages. So it's probably the case, since there is no direct relationship between, say, Hindi and Indian Sign Language, or between BSL and English, the basis is that, of course, there are forms that represent meaning, but they're not, they don't necessarily match one-to-one with any given spoken language. Sign languages tend to have very complex morphology. The comparison between the morphology of English, which is pretty not there, basically, and BSL, which has a very complex morphology. So verbs, there are 3 different classes of verbs, each of which requires a different kind of morphological marking. Verbs of location and direction have marking of the agent and of the object. Spatial verbs you have to mark the class of object on the verb, so the hand shape in the verb changes. So it's very, very complex. And as I've said before, that because sign languages tend to be, they make use of the fact that there are 2 main articulators which can do things at the same time. A lot of the morphology is it's simultaneous. It's so instead of having things strung out in a row, like in spoken language, in English you have prefixes and you have suffixes. It actually looks more like languages, like Semitic languages, which have what's called non-concatenative morphology, and that means, it's a big word that just means morphology where bits are stuck on one after the other. The morphology is kind of inserted into other bits of the language. So I hope that helped. Right, why do some deaf people get their cochlear implants removed when they grow up? That's a very different question. The use of hearing aids or cochlear implants by people depends on whether they find them useful. And also for hearing aids and cochlear implants, sometimes there are features of them that people find distressing to use. So you may get tinnitus, so noise, sounds in your ear that aren't really there. It may be that all of the people you interact with are signers, so you don't need an implant or want an implant. For some people, it's a measure of identity with other deaf people. Some people don't like cochlear implants because there are issues about sports and so on. So there are many different reasons, probably as many as there are people who remove their implants. But we don't have much data yet because, of course, early implantation is less than 20 years old. And so we don't know what will happen when those people are older. I mean, most implants are in children. Please list a few professional journals in sign language. There's only one journal published in sign language and it's in the United States, and I can't remember its name, but I can find it out. It's published, however, in American Sign Language with occasional papers in International Sign, but there have not been papers in other sign languages. So it's a very limited field at the moment. Next one was about removing the deaf gene. There certainly was somebody who was planning to do that, and there isn't one deaf gene. There's dozens of deaf genes. So this person was only planning to remove, to work on a single gene that's associated with recessive familial deafness. I don't know what happened. I have to say I am opposed to that, or indeed to other people who have done pre-implant genetic testing of embryos in order to destroy any deaf embryos and only implant hearing ones. What is important about humanity is its diversity. And I think, being deaf is not life-threatening. It doesn't threaten your opportunity to earn a living and marry and have children and have a successful life. It's not a condition that kills you as a baby after much suffering. And so, my view is that's just not the way I would want to see things. Are sign languages acquired in the same way as spoken language? Well, if you're a deaf child with deaf parents, the answer is yes. You're born, your parents sign to you, from the day you're born. Other people in the family sign, that's fine. You get older, you go to school, you sign at school. That's all very typical. But for 95% of deaf children, that's not the case. So they don't acquire sign language in this kind of natural way. Their parents may learn sign language, but obviously they're not very fluent and they don't know it right away. They may not be exposed to sign language till they go to school. That's very typical. So basically, sign languages can be acquired in the same way as spoken language, but typically they are not. So atypical experience is typical. So it's rare to have. One can develop programs that make it as typical as possible by having lots of exposure, help with parents in learning to sign, getting to meet deaf adults as a child, going to a deaf or a deaf and hearing mixed nursery, signing with other children. So one can make it more the same way. Is there a similarity in fMRI between vocalization and sign language? Okay, so this is talking about productive language. And there have been very few studies because the only way you can really do this kind of study is not with fMRI. You can't use fMRI for production of language. There have been some studies using PET, which is, I won't give you the translation, it's a different system, but it involves injecting radioactive water into the person to make to show up on the scan. And this is a procedure which, again, just for research, it's very difficult to get, permission to do that kind of thing. I mean, who wants radioactive fluid injected? But there have been a few studies by Karen Emery, and they indicate that speaking and signing generally activate the same language areas of the brain, but different motor areas, obviously. Is there any way to convert spoken language into sign language? Well, it's the same issue as converting sign language into spoken language. I mean, I was talking about translation, probably much easier from written text into a sign language, but no one is anywhere near achieving that. I mean, it's a long way off, partly because it's a very complex thing to do, partly because there's not enough corpora of sign language data that's suitable for using for this kind of task, and partly the other things I mentioned, that people are sort of asking the wrong questions and therefore working on things which will never develop into a system. But these avatar projects are exactly that. Okay, I take it that the question about whether gesture contributed to spoken language development is to do with evolution. So I've answered that, and I've also addressed this issue of whether using gestures by individuals in the present time contributes to spoken language development, and it does. How can sign language be used for deaf people with moderate intellectual disabilities? Well, I think you have to ask the question, would this person's level of intellectual ability enable them to learn spoken language if they weren't deaf? In which case, expose them to sign language. I know of, I've done some research on signers with Down syndrome who sign, as well as they use spoken language, but no better. There are some semi-artificial systems that are used for deaf people with severe intellectual disability. But actually, I think the question to ask is, would a hearing person of the same intellectual ability be able to use spoken language? Then the answer is yes, they could use sign language. There's no difference in difficulty in learning a spoken language versus a sign language.
So Benzi, I think we can take this question as last because we're running out of time.
Okay.
So Bishop Joshi's question can be the last one, and then I can email you the other ones and we can respond to the participants.
I think Bensi has got disconnected.
Yes, madam.
Yeah.
So I think we'll just wait till she joins and then we're just going to conclude the session.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am. Madam, I think she's not able to connect. We can conclude the session if she joins. We'll say thank you to her.
Yeah.
Yes. All right.
You can please go ahead with that.
Yeah, because we've taken a lot of time. So thank you everyone for attending this talk today. We're very grateful that Bensi came here and shared her insights with us. She shared her body of research, and as I said in the beginning, also it's been more influential. And as you know, Bensi is, an authority on so many strands of research in sign language that in India, I think Bensi is here. Hello. Bensi, sorry.
Hello. So you're back. Yeah, please.
Yes. Yes. Bensi, not audible? Bensi, audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Bensi, you're not audible. Bensi, you'll have to, yeah.
You can continue to thank her. She'll be able to listen.
Yes. Okay. Bensi, you're not audible. So, Bensi, I'm just concluding the session. I still can't hear you, but I just want to say thank you to you Yes, you're
Can you hear
audible.
me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
Benson, yes. Thank you very much for this wonderfully insightful talk, Benson. As I was just concluding, we're very grateful that you joined us here today. And I really like a stern message also that had to go out, because some of the research that you pointed out, and I'm very sorry to say this, some of these words, some of these terminology, sad to say that it is coming out from India itself. These terminologies such as deaf and dumb, offensive terminology, not involving deaf researchers, or on taking away credits. You're using them in the study but not putting their name. So a lot of ethical considerations we need to look in our own backyard, in our own home, sadly. But having said that, Bensi, I mean, we want to be optimistic, and I think because as you can see, a lot of things are changing also. Most of these, as you rightly said, a lot of funding is going into technology research. In fact, we have a couple of esteemed teachers from IITs, and IITs are funding, Indian Institute of Technologies are in fact funding huge amounts of projects dealing with translation, machine translation of sign language to spoken language. And I think your talk today has highlighted that there is a need for technology researchers also to involve the deaf community to maintain ethical standards, to do away with offensive terminology, because you cannot be using the subjects and then doing away with them. So with this note, and as we are celebrating International Day of Sign Languages, a day for celebration of this wonderful language, wonderful community, wonderful sense of identity, I would like to say that you've ended on a very positive note. I want to also say, working as a researcher in India, that things are changing. I'm very optimistic about this, and I think your talk today will have an impact on future linguists, future technology researchers as well. So Bensi, thank you very much once again for being here today. I would now quickly ask my colleague, Mayuri Madam, to please quickly, briefly, just give us a vote of thanks. Sorry, we've really lagged behind, but thank you to the participants for staying with us. Yes, Madam.
On behalf of Department of Linguistics, Central University, Rajasthan, the audience, and on my own behalf, we extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Professor Bensi Wool for presenting her findings and opinions today on the topic multimodality in sign language. And also, I would like to add that our Honorable Vice Chancellor was also there, Professor Neeraj Gupta, sir, and thank you, sir, for being with us. We may like to express our sincere thanks to Professor Hole for expressing an excellent coverage of various topics in sign language. Like we all know that there is a lot of computational linguistics going on, and still there is a huge amount of work that has to be done. Like there is no proper tagging, annotated tagged corpus, and there is also a lot of improvements that have to be done in the project of avatars, and how we also got a lot of awareness how we need to treat the deaf individuals. And there is also less work that has been done in Asian, African, and South American sign languages. And finally, thank you very much, ma'am, for providing this informative talk. Finally, I may express my sincere thanks to the participants who are linguistics scholars, interpreters, sign language interpreters, colleagues, and students for making this a successful event. I'm sure the event showed a new direction of linguistic avenues and future possibilities and prospects. And we once again thank everyone for your gracious presence, and we look forward to meet you all in our future talks in the Linguistics Department, Central University, Rajasthan. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Yes. Then
Thank you
that
very
concludes our session. Yes.
Okay, thank you all, and best of luck in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you again to all the participants, my interpreters here today, Atul Kumar, Jyoti Singh, you've done a wonderful job. So thank you very much. And I'll end with wishing everybody a very happy International Day of Sign Languages. It's a new tradition, and I think you'll join Central University Rajasthan every year to celebrate this. So thank you once again.
Thank you, and best to all. Bye.
Thank you.